Hi, welcome everybody. This is a presentation of Sociology of Sport, Growth, Diversification and Marginalization, 1981 to 2021, and the article was written by Jay Coakley. This paper tells the story of sociology of sport from 1981 to 2020. Now, if you want a summary from 1961 to 1980, check out the references. And this is described by Greendorfer. And basically, the research back then focused on how the field emerged, and it was connected to research on play, games, and sport. Research back then was conducted by sociologists, anthropologists, social psychologists, and physical educators, and these fueled the interest in the social dimensions of movement, activities, and sport. Now, the body and physical activity were mostly ignored by social scientists because they gave priority to the mind over the body. And sport and physical activity were pretty risky topics and not supported by institutions. That means professors in different institutions that studied sociology, if they wanted to get tenure, they needed to give priority to the mind and not priority to the body. And that's why they were largely neglecting the sociology of sport. Now, European and North American scientists started researching this in 1960, and they contributed to knowledge about society, culture, and organized sports, which were more visible and important in many societies by this time. And then in the 1980s, more scholars were excited to study sports and physical activities that were previously neglected in sociological and cultural studies. So now, over the last 40 years, the sociology of sport has produced knowledge about the organization and dynamics of sport, as well as their relationship with societies and cultures. It is now recognized as important as it is connected with, first, sports being more visible, culturally important, and profitable. Then, sports social issues getting more media coverage. Also, obesity, quality of life, and healthcare resources. The use of sports for business profit and political power. Athletes' rights and activism. Positive outcomes of sport participation under conducive circumstances. And then the legitimacy of sports sociology relates to the creation of media content, identifying organizational issues, developing effective management strategies, improving health, policy decisions, and resource allocation. The organizational infrastructure of the field of sports sociology consists of professional associations that sponsor conferences and publish journals. These publications add legitimacy and introduce research findings to a wider audience. We have the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport that was created in 1978. We used to have the Sports Sociology Academy, which used to coordinate sessions at the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. We still have the European Association for Sociology of Sport, which was created in 2001, the Korean Society for the Sociology of Sport, and the Japan Society for the Sociology of Sport that were created in 1991, and the Latin American Association of Sociocultural Studies of Sport, which was created in 2007. Early on, research was very descriptive and it identified how sports were organized, governed, and linked to other spheres of society. Later, it became more interpretative and critical. Interpretative research focuses on the subjective experiences of fans, participants, and other people as they relate to sports. And critical research focuses on understanding how social conditions impact ideas, beliefs, and actions that are related to sport, and how these conditions systematically advance some people and disadvantage other people. The most common current contributors to journals are from over 54 countries and multiple disciplinary affiliations that complement each other and introduce new ideas and new interpretations. The most common affiliations are departments of kinesiology, sport and exercise science, sport and health, sport management, physical education, sociology, sports studies, and media studies. This diversity, in part, exists because mainstream sociology hasn't formally embraced the field of sports sociology. So to sustain this diversity, associations and journals have chosen names such as Sports and Society instead of sports sociology. This is done intentionally to create more space for a variety of topics, research methods, and different theories. And maintaining this disciplinary diversity is a process that requires attention and commitment, so scholars feel welcome and meaningfully included, both socially and professionally. It's important to note that this also applies to keeping and expanding identity diversity, including values, experiences, and interests. Sociology of sports hasn't been seen as actively committed to openness by females, scholars of color, or LGBTQIA+ scholars. As far as the research questions and the topics that guide the field, in the 1960s and the 1970s, the study's topics focused on socialization into, out of, and throughout sports, sports as a social institution and a system, sports and social problems, race and sports, and women and sports. Now, sociology of sports in the US was influenced by scholar activists with experience in sports, and they asked critical questions about organization and cultures of professional and elite sports, what we will call pro-Olympics, and how that impacted the athletes. Now, their critiques increased their awareness of inequities, racism, and exploitation. Then also, former athletes and the media also raised questions about distorted priorities, unethical actions, and exploitation, and all of this combined gave the field urgency, passion, and even direction. The top 10 keywords in articles published in the US are sports, gender, race, women, media, politics, identity, body, masculinity, and football. And then in Europe, the top 10 keywords are sports, football, identity, gender, culture, masculinity, body, media, globalizations, and then there's a tie between politics and race. And just remember that culturally, football in the United States means something different than football in Europe. One is soccer and the other one is football. So what is the future of the research in sports sociology going to look like? Well, Coakley thinks that it's going to revolve around global issues, secondary and higher education, and defining sport. As far as global issues, research is likely to focus on sports for development and peace, public health issues, human rights and social justice, citizenship, social movements, political activism, eradicating poverty and food insecurity, gender and gender identity inequities, nationalism and racism, individual and social structural development, environmental and community sustainability, climate change, political and economical contexts, support for immigrants, refugees, indigenous people, aging populations, people with disabilities, etc., resources for social and economic development, pro-Olympic sports, dynamics and the consequences of commercialization, costs and the legacies of mega events, athletes' rights, activism of fans and athletes, performance-enhancing drugs and technology, actual or anticipated terrorism and terrorism threats, new communication technology that is going to alter the relationships between the athletes, the fans, the media, blurring national borders, gambling, corruption, and then even other forms of sports such as lifestyle, action, adventure, recreational, folk, and people sports, which are defined in the article as sports that are created, changed, or abandoned by and for participants. Then let's move on to secondary and higher education. So research is needed to assess if high-cost interscholastic programs should be eliminated, reformatted, revisited, or replaced by any or a combination of student-led sports and physical recreation that extend the socialization and education that happens in the classroom. Now, these topics, the topics of research in the interscholastic departments that do remain will include transparency, accountability, corruption, educational relevance, exploitation, athletes' rights, and performance and development of both the program and the athlete. And then the definition of sport. Sport, now we know, is an elastic concept that represents diverse lived experiences that are shaped by historical, cultural, political, economic, and environmental factors. Now, this view of sports takes into account the difference between the official, and I'm doing air quotes here, definition of sports that reflects the interests of the people with influence and powers, and then sports defined as contested activities with various purpose, meaning, and organization, definitions of who plays under what conditions, how governance and sponsorship occurs, etc. A current example is esports claiming status or being perceived as sports by some people. Scholars using figurational theory, we talked about figurational theory earlier in the module, so scholars using figurational theory use the term sportization. Let me repeat that because it sounds like a made-up word, but it isn't. Sportization. And this is the process of defining an artistic or physical activity as a sport. And imagine this: breakdancing, rhythmic gymnastics, orienteering, climbing, ultimate, Quidditch, competitive eating. And so you can study any of this from a lens of sports in society. Whether you consider them sports or not is irrelevant. The culture where you are immersed, considering them as sport, the participants of the activity considering them as sport, is what is going to classify them as sport under sportization and under figurational theory, because they're the ones that culturally get to decide what a sport is. So how interesting is that? The challenges for the field are that it faces extinction due to lack of support in universities, in departments, and tenure is difficult to get for professors. Positions aren't refilled when a professor retires, and new positions are rare. And then new researchers are selecting to focus on other areas to advance professionally. Also, disciplinary diversity has a downside, which is lack of leverage to lobby for support, to retain courses, degree programs, and faculty positions. And this makes it to where sports sociology is a low priority topic in higher education. So for example, when AFER became SHAPE, subdisciplines such as sociology, history, and philosophy disappeared, and many physical educators can no longer present and publish at AFER. Similar processes are happening across kinesiology departments where these subdisciplines are disappearing. So this lack of structural unity also is going to breed intellectual isolation of sports sociology scholars who find themselves alone in their university. And many departments buy into the great sport myth, which is sports are pure, sports are good, participation in sports leads to individual and community development. And thinking this way and having blinders on inhibits the recognition for the need of critical research by sports sociologists, and it undermines the legitimacy of the field. A strategy for countering structural unity or structural unity lack of support is a formal commitment to inclusion by associations and journals. And this inclusion needs to be in identity and in diversity, and it requires continuously listening to, learning about, and actively supporting colleagues for the field to become a strong, vibrant context for knowledge production and political leverage. And then another strategy is access to knowledge in other languages, and that way the field is going to grow and we're going to prevent Western hegemony. As far as predicting the future of the field, the actor acknowledged that's really hard to do. He thinks that the research trajectory of pro-Olympic sports is going to be sustained by globalization, commercialization, and the seeking of excitement. Public health crisis will be fueling the need for physical activities and organizations and dynamics of physical activities and sports and how they are integrated in people's lives. And the future of any field is created, not predicted. So it emerges at actions of principles in well-understood contexts. So the challenge here is for scholars to set the research and teaching priorities, to remain unified and strategic, and to lobby their choices while being aware of the conditions in which they work and willing to modify those conditions. So if you have any questions, now will be the time for questions, and you can have a summary of this article as well as access to the video of this presentation at claudiabames.com.